Welcome to this virtual presentation and thank you for your interest in our research. This talk will be about the PD component and how it reflects the suppression of salient distractors below baseline. In many everyday situations, more information is presented to our visual system than it can process. For example, if you're young or young at heart, it can be a very common challenge in your everyday life to find a Lego brick of the right shape and color in a pile of Lego bricks. Because our visual system has a limited processing capacity, we can't process all Lego bricks at once. This is where visual attention comes in handy because it allows us to optimize the use of the limited processing capacity by filtering relevant from irrelevant information. Two subsystems have been hypothesized: enhancement of relevant information and suppression of irrelevant information. Now, suppression is particularly helpful when there is something salient like this neon Lego brick that is potentially capturing our attention. The competition between goal-congruent stimuli and physically salient stimuli, such as in the example of the Lego bricks, has been simulated in the lab with the additional singleton paradigm originally used by Tevis in 1992. This has been adapted in many different ways. Here you can see a few examples. They all have in common that a target stimulus competes with an irrelevant but salient distractor. A typical finding in these additional singleton tasks is that response times and error rates go up when the salient distractor is presented, suggesting that there is some interference due to the salient distractor. Now the question is, can we prevent this attentional capture through application of active suppression? In terms of models of attention, it may be that not only are targets represented with a higher activation on the priority map than neutral distractors, but salient distractors may be represented even with a negative activation on the priority map due to active suppression, which makes then their selection even less likely than for neutral distractors. This brings us to the question, is there neural evidence for attentional suppression below baseline? An important advancement to measure attentional suppression has been made with the systematic lateralization of targets and distractors in visual search tasks that was brought forward in a seminal study by Hickey and colleagues in 2009. First of all, when a target is presented laterally, it elicits an N2PC, that is a negativity contralateral to the target, and this N2PC reflects how much and when attention is deployed to the target. Importantly, when the roles are swapped and now only the salient distractor is presented laterally with the target on the vertical midline, the neural activity related to the singleton processing can be isolated because the target can't affect the lateralized signal. Hickey and colleagues found a novel component, the distractor positivity or PD component. This positivity, contralateral to the salient distractors, presumably reflecting reduced priority of the distractor. And because it is of positive polarity, whereas the N2PC is negative, it may be intuitive to assume that now we're looking at a measure of suppression. However, it may also be that the PD merely reflects less enhancement compared to the target. This brings us to the goal of the present study. We wanted to measure the PD component as a function of how well a singleton was suppressed. Of course, first of all, we needed to establish what a good measure for behavioral suppression would be. So we looked at a series of studies by Gasplin and colleagues who measured suppression with a combined visual search and probe task. In 70% of their trials, participants had to search for a shape target, for example a diamond, while a salient colored distractor was present as well. This presumably made participants attend the target while simultaneously suppress the additional singleton. In the remaining 30% of the trials, the search array was only briefly presented and then replaced with a probe array. In these trials, participants had to report as many letters as possible from within all items, regardless whether it was a target shape, a distractor, or singleton. So this was a way to behaviorally probe attention at all locations. They found that when participants had to report as many letters as possible, they would report more from the target than distractor location, showing attentional enhancement at the target location. Interestingly, they reported even fewer letters from the salient distractor location, which is direct behavioral evidence for suppression below baseline. In a follow-up study, they also replicated this with overt attention deployments. Participants made fewer saccades towards singleton distractors than towards a neutral distractor. In another follow-up study by Gasplin and Luck, a PD component was found to be elicited by the salient distractor, similar to various previous studies. Now, because they also used probe trials, they could correlate the behavioral measure of suppression in the probe trials with the PD component in the search trials, and found that those participants with a larger PD reported letters from the salient distractor location less likely, suggesting that the PD may indeed reflect suppression. In the present study, we wanted to have a closer look at how the PD responds to attending versus suppressing the salient distractor. Here, participants always, in 100% of the trials, had to find the target and report the digit within. Our hypothesis was that the PD reflects suppression below baseline. This is a correlational approach. So if participants successfully attend the target, which means that they suppress the color singleton sufficiently, we should see a relatively large PD. If, however, suppression fails and participants attend the singleton erroneously, we should see a relatively small PD. Here you can see a trial procedure. The search displays were only shown for 120 milliseconds and then subsequently masked. Singletons were presented in 50% of the trials and could be red, blue, or green. We used singleton lateral trials to measure the PD and target lateral trials to measure the N2PC. Due to the short presentation in the mask, the task was hard enough to provoke errors. Participants would report the incorrect items sufficiently often to measure the EEG signal, and we could then directly link the neural response in the EEG signal to attending a specific item, for example, the additional singleton. Behavioral results showed that it took participants around 50 milliseconds longer to report the target identity when an additional singleton was present compared to when no such additional singleton was present. We also looked at the report frequency. We replicated Gasplin and colleagues' findings. Target identities were more often reported than neutral distractor identities, and singleton distractor identities were less often reported than neutral distractor identities, showing that in the present study we observed behavioral evidence for suppression below baseline. Interestingly, suppression evolved over time. This suggests that participants learned to suppress the singletons throughout the scope of the experiment and reached the maximum suppression efficiency towards the end of the experiment. Now let's have a look at the EEG results. As a reminder, we analyzed the EEG as a function of what participants responded. These are the singleton distractor lateral trials in which we should observe a PD. Let's start with the trials in which participants responded correctly, so when they reported the target identity. You can see that there is a PD in the early PD time window. This PD was also found when they erroneously reported a neutral distractor, albeit small in amplitude. If, however, they ended up reporting the singleton distractor, the PD was virtually absent at this early point in time. In a second later time window, the PD was present regardless which item was reported. In sum, these results suggest that the PD might reflect the behavioral suppression that we observed. The idea being that a lack of early suppression, as evident in the absence of a PD in the early time window, results in an increased chance to erroneously attend the distractor and report its identity instead of the target identity. Interestingly, we also observed a CDA component in the singleton lateral trials. The CDA reflects the storage of items in working memory. As the CDA was largest in singleton report trials, our data suggest that the accidental storage of distractors in working memory may have contributed to the behavioral errors in these trials. Now let's have a look at the target lateral trials. Here you can see that the targets elicited an N2PC, so they were attended, but the N2PC amplitude did not vary as a function of what item was reported. This suggests that how much attention was deployed towards the target did not determine if the correct item was reported. The target, just like the singleton, also elicited a CDA component. The CDA was largest in correct trials, suggesting that the encoding of the target contributed to the successful report of the target identity. To conclude, we found that erroneously attending salient distractors coincided with a smaller and later PD, but not with a smaller N2PC. Although this is still a correlational approach, our data strongly suggests that the PD is suitable as a neural marker of suppression. Our data also suggests that suppression of a salient distractor may sometimes be more important than the enhancement of the target, because in situations like in the present study, when competition is very hard between the target and the distractor, here the distractor was very salient, had an unpredictable color, and the display was also marked. In these cases, it might be particularly beneficial to suppress the salient information. Secondly, we also found that erroneously reporting salient distractors coincided with the CDA contralateral to the distractor, suggesting that the accidental encoding of salient distractors into working memory may also contribute to behavioral errors. Thank you very much for your attention.